The story begins on a quiet southern morning. A crowded bus, a woman sitting still, not in rebellion, but in truth. The driver's command cuts through the air. Get up. Yet Maya Angelou doesn't move. Her stillness feels heavier than words. In that moment, the fear that ruled generations meets its end, not through violence, but through presence. That single act of refusal becomes a symbol, not just of resistance, but of awakening, a woman choosing dignity over obedience, self-awareness over silence. And from that moment, the ripple begins. But here's the thing most people miss, that courage didn't start on that bus. It started years earlier, when Maya lost her voice as a child and discovered the weight of silence. When she finally spoke again, her words carried the entire spectrum of light and darkness, pain transmuted into poetry, trauma reborn as inner transformation. Her life became emotional alchemy in motion, the art of turning fear into wisdom and empathy into power. Maya's story isn't about fame or defiance. It's about what happens when a soul stops living for approval and starts living in truth. She loved deeply, felt endlessly, but learned the power of the mind, that compassion without boundaries is captivity. She embodied Jungian psychology without ever naming it, the moment when the unconscious mind rises and says, "No more pretending." And maybe that's where this story quietly becomes yours too. Because somewhere inside you, there's a version of that same bus, a place where fear has been driving for too long. And there's a moment waiting, just like hers, when you'll decide to stop standing up for others and finally stand up for yourself. So let me ask you, what happens when the empath, you, stops fearing rejection and starts living in truth? When you no longer chase belonging, but become it. Most people think rejection is something you move past, like a sting that fades. But for an empath, it becomes a silent architect of the self. It's how the persona and shadow begin to take shape, one part desperately seeking love through emotional awareness, the other burying the repressed self deep within the unconscious mind. In Jungian psychology, this is the moment the mask starts forming, not out of vanity, but out of survival. The empath learns early that being too much or too sensitive can push people away, so they shrink their light to fit the room. And over time, that shrinking becomes a habit that feels like home. It's a hidden prison, built from kindness that's been misunderstood. They become experts in projection and perception, reading every micro-expression, adjusting tone and energy like emotional alchemists trying to keep harmony. Yet that same shadow work they fear could set them free. Carl Jung wrote that what you resist persists. So the more an empath resists rejection, the more they invite it. They start believing love must be earned through emotional labor, not authenticity. They forget that compassion without self-respect isn't compassion. It's self-betrayal wearing a halo. You'll often see this pattern in everyday life. Think of the friend who always says yes, even when exhausted. Or the partner who keeps giving chances to someone who's not growing. They confuse empathy with endurance. But here's the paradox. True inner transformation starts the moment one dares to disappoint others. To stop performing emotional miracles for everyone and instead explore the power of the mind, not to control, but to choose. It's in these small acts of truth that the empath begins to reclaim fragments of their authentic self. In the language of depth psychology, this is the empath's first initiation in the hero's journey, the archetypal path that every soul walks, though few realize it. The empath begins in the ordinary world, shaped by expectations and emotional survival. The call to adventure comes disguised as burnout, heartbreak, or the unbearable weight of pretending. At first, they refuse the call, afraid to lose love if they show their truth. But mentors appear, sometimes as pain itself, guiding them into the unknown terrain of shadow integration techniques and inner alchemy. And every test, every no they speak, every tear they don't hide, becomes a threshold they cross toward individuation, toward becoming whole. Inside that hidden prison, every no they've swallowed becomes a ghost whispering, "You're unworthy." But if they turn inward, if they begin healing the inner child who feared rejection, they start decoding the deeper symbols and meanings behind their pain. They realize rejection was never a verdict. It was a mirror reflecting where they abandoned themselves first. The empath who once feared rejection now sees it as initiation, the necessary death before rebirth. And as that spiritual awakening deepens, compassion doesn't vanish, it transforms. The next chapter is about learning to protect that newfound truth, when compassion finally meets boundaries. After the prison begins to dissolve, something quiet and strange happens inside the empath, a pause. It's not joy yet, not freedom, just a sudden stillness after years of emotional noise. The silence feels almost unsettling, because without the role of the caretaker, who are they? This is the first real moment of awakening, when compassion, once a reflex, becomes a conscious act. The empath starts to see that loving everyone without limits wasn't divine. It was the unconscious mind begging for acceptance. And now, that same mind begins whispering a new truth. Love isn't proven through pain. It's sustained through presence, clarity, and truth. This realization doesn't arrive with trumpets. It creeps in through exhaustion, through one more yes that tastes like regret. It's the soul's way of saying, enough. In Jungian psychology, this is when the self begins to rise from the collective unconscious, demanding authenticity. The empath, who once avoided conflict like fire, begins to sense the power of the mind in choosing peace without pleasing. They start experimenting with boundaries, responding later, saying less, listening inwardly before reacting outwardly. And though it feels unnatural at first, that discomfort is sacred, it's inner transformation in motion. Boundaries, to a maturing empath, are not fences but frequency filters. They keep the heart open while keeping chaos out. It's the alchemy of trauma, learning to transmute fear into discernment. Some practice this by journaling their triggers, studying Carl Jung or shadow integration techniques. Others learn through real-life encounters, a draining friend, a manipulative boss, a relationship that mirrors their repressed self. With each act of self-honesty, they feel a surge of power, not dominance but calm. It's what Jung called the individuation process, the sacred return to one's own center. And here lies the paradox. Boundaries don't make the empath less compassionate, they make compassion sustainable. Before, empathy meant absorption, feeling everything until nothing was left. Now it means resonance, feeling deeply without drowning. This is spiritual awakening in action, where light and darkness finally coexist without war. The empath learns that saying no is sometimes the purest form of love, because it honors both souls involved. It's the moment compassion stops rescuing and starts respecting. Yet even in this newfound clarity, the shadow watches from the corners of awareness. Old fears begin to resurface, the same ones born in the hidden prison. What if they leave? What if I'm too cold now? That's the next initiation, when the inner shadow rises not to punish, but to integrate. Because boundaries without self-knowledge become armor, not evolution. And so, the empath must face the tender darkness beneath their kindness. When the empath begins to set boundaries, something unexpected happens. The peace they longed for starts to feel unsettling. Silence now echoes where approval once lived. That's when the inner shadow awakens. The same unconscious mind that once hid behind kindness now reveals its trembling shape. Beneath the compassion lies fear. Fear of abandonment, of being unseen, of losing worth when not needed. Jungian psychology teaches that every virtue has a shadow. Even kindness can mask a deep longing to be loved. The empath now realizes that endless giving wasn't always selfless. Sometimes, it was a negotiation for safety. This confrontation feels like standing in front of a mirror that doesn't flatter. They begin to notice subtle moments, the tight smile when unappreciated, the quiet resentment after helping too much. These are not flaws, but fragments of the repressed self rising for integration. In shadow work, this is sacred territory, the borderland between awareness and illusion. The empath starts journaling their reactions, tracing emotions back to their origin. Sometimes, they discover a childhood memory, a parent's sigh of disappointment, a teacher's criticism, an early wound that taught them love must be earned. And now, that wound becomes the key to their inner transformation. Robin Williams embodied this paradox, the radiant light that hid a private darkness. To millions, he was pure joy, the voice that made others laugh through their pain. Yet behind the laughter lived the wounded healer, the archetype that heals others while quietly bleeding. Like many empaths, he mastered projection and perception, feeling everyone's sadness and transmuting it into humor, but rarely allowing space for his own. His life mirrors what Carl Jung described as the shadow of the healer, where compassion becomes a disguise for loneliness. In his art, we see the meaning of life and the collective unconscious dancing between light and despair, a testimony to the complexity of the human psyche. The beauty of this process is brutal honesty. Carl Jung called it the alchemy of trauma, the art of turning emotional pain into consciousness. The empath learns to sit with discomfort instead of fixing it, to let sadness speak before silencing it with positivity. They begin to see that light and darkness are not enemies, but partners in evolution. The goal isn't to get rid of the shadow, it's to bring it into dialogue. Through emotional awareness, the empath starts practicing phrases like, "I feel this, but it doesn't define me." Each repetition weakens the spell of unconscious conditioning and strengthens the power of the mind. At this stage, the empath begins to see patterns not as punishments but as mirrors. They recognize how psychological archetypes, the caregiver, the martyr, the wounded healer, have silently shaped their behavior. In relationships, these archetypes manifest through projection and perception. The empath attracts people who mirror their hidden fears, their unmet needs, their unspoken anger. Jung and modern psychology both affirm that what we don't face internally, we meet externally. So when the empath finally sees how rejection was never from others, but from their own denied parts, the collective unconscious begins to shift within them. And that's where true courage begins, not in perfection, but in presence. The empath starts practicing shadow integration techniques, conscious journaling, dream interpretation, meditation on the symbols and meanings that surface in nightmares or recurring images. Each act of awareness dissolves another layer of illusion, and as they face the darkness within, something luminous stirs, a quiet authenticity that doesn't need validation. But the journey is far from over, because soon they'll discover that authenticity itself can be terrifying and liberating. That's the next threshold, the power of authenticity, living without masks. When the empath finally stops hiding behind kindness, something miraculous begins to unfold. It's not a loud revolution, but a quiet homecoming. The false self, shaped by fear, praise, and survival, starts to crack, and the authentic self begins to breathe. For the first time, the empath realizes that authenticity isn't about being fearless, it's about being real. Jungian psychology calls this the moment of individuation, when the soul reclaims what was lost to adaptation. In the unconscious mind, the walls between persona and shadow soften, allowing the light of truth to seep in. And that light, though gentle, burns through illusion like fire. Authenticity feels strange at first, almost naked. The empath, once fluent in emotional camouflage, now stumbles when speaking truth. They might lose friends, jobs, even relationships that were built on performance. But that loss is sacred. In the collective unconscious, every human carries the archetype of the hero's journey, and this is the death and rebirth phase, where the false identity dissolves so the real one can rise. It's the hardest part of inner transformation, because it demands letting go of the very masks that once kept them safe. Yet beneath the fear lies a calm strength, the power of the mind remembering its own design. Take Jim Carrey, for example. After decades of being the world's clown, he openly shared his spiritual awakening, how success and applause became empty once he realized he was playing a role, not living a truth. His journey mirrors the empath's path from performance to presence. Through depth psychology, we can see this as the collapse of the inflated persona and the integration of the repressed self. When he said, "I wish everyone could become rich and famous so they'd realize that's not the answer," he was speaking from the archetype of the fool turned sage, where laughter becomes enlightenment. His story is a modern parable of the alchemy of trauma, a man who transmuted public identity into spiritual awareness, who turned comedy into consciousness. In shadow work, living without masks means embracing contradictions, the anger beneath love, the sorrow behind humor, the vulnerability inside courage. Authenticity isn't polished, it's raw, textured, and beautifully imperfect. The empath learns to use emotional alchemy to transform discomfort into wisdom. Instead of hiding pain, they express it through art, voice, or silence. Some start painting their dreams, others write letters they never send. These acts become rituals of healing through awareness, ways to turn wounds into wisdom. It's like refining gold. The heat of truth burns away false layers until only the essence remains. That's inner alchemy, transformation through fire, not avoidance. And when that moment arrives, when truth replaces performance, empathy itself changes texture. It becomes lighter, freer, no longer tethered to approval or fear. The unconscious mind no longer needs to manipulate love, because love has become natural again. But authenticity, though liberating, comes with a cost, solitude. As the empath stands in their truth, the world may misinterpret their calm as coldness, their clarity as distance. Yet this solitude is not punishment, it's preparation, the stillness before expansion. Because once they learn to love without masks, the next step is learning to love without fear, the fearless state, love without attachment, empathy without absorption. When the empath reaches this point, love begins to feel different, lighter, yet deeper. The emotional intensity that once drowned them becomes clarity. They no longer confuse connection with merging or compassion with sacrifice. Jungian psychology would call this stage the integration of opposites, where light and darkness coexist without resistance. The empath has learned that true love flows best through freedom, not control. It's the fruit of inner transformation, love purified by truth, stripped of need, and rooted in awareness. This is the fearless state, where the power of the mind is guided by the wisdom of the heart. They start to see relationships not as cages but as mirrors, sacred spaces to practice emotional awareness. Every trigger becomes an opportunity to observe the unconscious mind at play. They notice when the repressed self tries to seek validation, and they gently return to the present. It's shadow work in real time, choosing to stay open without absorbing the other person's storm. The empath now recognizes projection and perception as two sides of the same coin, realizing that what they once blamed others for were reflections of their own unhealed parts. That understanding changes everything. In this new space of self-awareness, empathy becomes an act of strength, not depletion. They can sit with someone's pain without making it their own, a rare form of love that liberates both souls. This is emotional alchemy in its purest form, transforming attachment into compassion, expectation into presence. Think of it as spiritual awakening embodied. No halos, no perfection, just awareness flowing like breath. And through that awareness, The empath becomes both observer and participant, grounded in the meaning of life as it unfolds through human connection. Maya Angelou embodied this evolution of empathy. Born into racial trauma, poverty, and silence, she transmuted suffering into art and awareness. For years, she didn't speak, silenced by the weight of trauma, yet later became one of the most powerful voices of her time. That is the alchemy of trauma in motion. Her poetry, her presence, her laughter, all carried the essence of the wounded healer. She practiced shadow integration techniques long before they were named, transforming rage into rhythm, fear into faith, and vulnerability into universal truth. Her life was the hero's journey lived out loud, a passage from darkness into light, from silence into song. Maya showed the world that love is not absorption, it's understanding without judgment. Her empathy was not fragile, it was fierce, disciplined, and rooted in the inner voice of the self. And so the empath discovers the essence of the hero's journey. They were never meant to escape sensitivity, only to refine it. By embracing both persona and shadow, they've learned how to face the shadow without fear, and how to love without losing themselves. Synchronicity explained this moment long before they could name it. When inner harmony begins, outer harmony follows. Love becomes an act of freedom, empathy becomes discernment, and connection becomes sacred. And now, standing in that fearless calm, the empath finally feels what they've been searching for all along: peace, not because the world changed, but because they did. So here you are, after the noise, the silence, and the shadow. You've walked through rejection, compassion, truth, and love, and now you stand where every empath must eventually arrive, the threshold of choice. Will you keep living as the mirror of others, or finally become your own reflection? The answer isn't found in perfection, it's found in presence. In this fearless state, the unconscious mind no longer drives the story, the self does. And once you taste that freedom, there's no turning back. Because you no longer chase peace, you become it. Ask yourself, how much of your kindness was really fear in disguise? How many times did you say yes just to avoid disappearing? What if every rejection you faced wasn't punishment, but synchronicity explained, the universe redirecting you toward your authentic self? That's the hidden beauty of shadow work. It turns pain into inner transformation and guilt into emotional alchemy. It's the invisible process of healing the inner child, of bringing light and darkness into union until they no longer fight, they collaborate. That's what Carl Jung meant when he said that wholeness is not achieved by cutting off the dark, but by embracing it. Maybe it's time to stop apologizing for feeling deeply. Maybe your sensitivity was never your weakness, but your compass, guiding you through the hero's journey of your own psyche. Every tear, every tremor of rejection, every silence, all of it was part of your individuation process. You were never broken. You were becoming. The repressed self wasn't your enemy. It was your sleeping power, waiting to be remembered. And now that you see it, you understand. Love without attachment isn't emptiness. It's liberation. It's spiritual awakening made real, not in temples or theories, but in everyday choices. Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the quiet between your thoughts. That's where truth lives. Imagine your life as a vast night sky, every shadow a star waiting to be named. When you bring awareness to the darkness, it no longer consumes you, it illuminates you. That's the paradox of depth psychology. The deeper you go into the unconscious, the higher your consciousness rises. The light you've been searching for was never out there. It was buried beneath the noise, beneath the fear of rejection, waiting for you to see it without judgment. So before you go, take this as your mirror. What truth have you silenced to stay loved? What dream have you postponed to stay safe? What mask have you worn so long that you forgot the sound of your own voice? This moment right now, is the invitation to begin again. Not as someone new, but as who you've always been. And if this message resonated with you, don't let it fade. Stay with this journey. Keep exploring the power of the mind, the symbolism of dreams, the meaning of life through Jungian psychology. Subscribe, turn on the notifications, and walk this path with us. Because awakening isn't a finish line, it's a rhythm, a conversation between light and shadow, and your voice belongs in it.